Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Ahrens, and today we'll be looking at sound production, specifically the singing tone. This subject is fraught with controversy for the simple reason that for many years pianists and pedagogues were debating points which arise as symptoms of the problem rather than fundamentals in the solution. Pianists look at arm and hand posture, follow-through motions, and even internal feelings like weight and the control of our center of gravity. But what is always forgotten is that the sound itself is what we're controlling, and therefore our individual biomechanics will ultimately perform differently when compared person to person. I will achieve a given sound quality differently in terms of hand mechanics than a pianist next door. And this gives further credence to the idea that there is no golden solution which can provide a pianist with instant singing tone. Of course, the natural question then becomes, why make an episode talking about singing tone if you can't help us to achieve it? Well, technically, you're right. I can't help you. What I can do is show you the boundaries of what you have to work with. Within these boundaries, you must each individually search for your own way to create the kind of sound quality you wish. When it comes to a singing tone, I have 3 facets which are of vital importance to follow. Understand your instrument, understand your body, and understand the musical context. In today's episode, we'll focus on the first. Understand your instrument. How would we describe a singing tone? Well, there are many different definitions, and not surprisingly, they are based in the beliefs of the people who created them in the first place. Some pianists enjoy hearing a tone that can be described as bright or focused, a tone with clear definition in terms of pitch. Something like this, perhaps. Some pianists like a tone that is veiled, with something of a halo around the sound, primarily undefined and amorphous in character. Making matters more complicated, some pianists talk about sound quality that reaches or projects to the back seats in an auditorium, as if the carrying power of an individual note was the defining factor for beauty in sound. Let's not forget that it's called a singing tone, and not a yelling or a screeching tone. Beauty is a defining part of it, but of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. This is one significant part of the problem. And due to the complete lack of definition, students are forever confused when, as an example, they've perfected the singing tone execution for one teacher, only to be told by another that their sound doesn't sing enough. If teachers cannot adequately define a singing tone to a student, how is the student supposed to know what they're trying to achieve? This leads to my 3 facets of creating a singing tone. The first is about understanding your instrument. What I mean by this is that the piano offers certain restrictions or constraints which we need to know about if we're going to know how to search for the sound quality we're looking for. When it comes to sound quality, we're essentially trying to control how percussive the note sounds, irrespective of volume. What you find on the piano is that the lower you go, the less naturally percussive the notes sound. sound in the lower register tends to take on a dull thud rather than a crisp snap. Conversely, the higher we go on the instrument, the more naturally percussive it gets. When we go high enough, it almost sounds like a wooden mallet striking the strings rather than a felt hammer. This exemplifies the first step in understanding our instrument. For all the advances in piano technology and construction, the piano still exhibits individual registers which react differently in terms of sound production. The lower the register, the less percussive the sound, and the higher the register, the more percussive. Simple. But how does this affect how we can achieve a singing tone? Well, to answer this, we have to go back to the question of how a singing tone can be defined, and combine that with what we know about percussive and non-percussive sounds. Singing tones in practice are sounds that appear to exhibit certain properties to the listener. For example, they tend to be louder than the accompaniments, but not so loud as to be offensive to the ear. Another way to say this is that the melody is loud, but not harsh in sound. Harsh notes tend to be very percussive in their sound quality. We can hear the smack of the note a little in advance of the pitch. So, if we want to be in the ballpark of singing tone sound quality, then we need a note that is non-percussive yet still loud. Where on the instrument can we find sounds that are naturally loud but not harsh? The bass, of course. We have a sound quality that can be described as being full, or as having lots of body to the sound. This natural singing tone quality to the bass is the reason why playing a melody in the lower and middle registers can appear to be a far easier endeavor than playing the same melody in the treble. As a pianist, we don't have to make any special adjustments to try and make the melody sing or sound smooth, because the register does it for us automatically, as long as our melody is simply loud enough. It works in Beethoven, it also works in Scriabin. As long as the melody is in a low register and is louder than everything else, we'll be okay in terms of a sound quality that sings. Playing a melody in the middle or lower registers gives us an auditory clue as to what we can try to achieve in the upper registers where melodies normally occur. In the lower registers, melodies sound legato. They sound like they sustain or carry, and they very rarely can sound percussive or detached. If the lower registers exhibit less percussiveness in sound, with lots of volume, then what can we do to replicate this situation when we are in a register that naturally exhibits less volume, less sustaining power, and of course more percussiveness? Well, let's consider what happens when we have melodies in the upper middle register. The Chopin Prelude I played at the beginning of this episode is a perfect example of the problems we can face when playing a melody in the upper middle register. The melody, on the one hand, seems rather exposed, and on a first try, it can seem like the only way to bring warmth to the sound quality is to overemphasize the warmth of the left-hand material, in the hopes that the warmth spills over to the right-hand tune. This is actually the opposite of what needs to be done in order to give the impression of a singing melody. Once again, we must understand our instrument. Let's say that we're trying to limit the percussiveness of our melodic line. This approach can only be heard if the left-hand material is made more percussive. In other words, we need an auditory frame of reference for the melodic line. Let's do this in an extreme way. I'll play the left hand relatively staccato and the right hand as legato as possible. The first thing to learn here is that, given the nature of the instrument, we must compensate for the differences in register. Not only must we try to make the upper register less percussive, but we must also try to increase the percussive element of the lower register in order to make a difference. That's the first step to mimicking the sound quality of a lower register melody. The second step then becomes quite easy. Play the melody louder than the accompaniment. This works in Rachmaninoff. This works in Debussy. It works everywhere. I have talked about percussive issues a lot in this episode, but I have not talked about how we as pianists go about changing our sound quality to be more or less percussive. In order to do this, I have to start talking about our physical approach to the keyboard and how this affects sound quality. This is part of my second facet of singing tone, that of understanding your body, and I'll discuss this in another episode. But for now, let's quickly recap the ideas behind understanding your instrument. The lower registers naturally produce an ideal singing tone, and the trick to creating one in the upper registers is to find a way to replicate the properties of the lower sounds. This means finding a way to make the upper registers resonate for a long time, to do so without sounding too percussive in nature, and to adapt the accompaniment to give the impression that the melodic line is less percussive than it actually is. It's a lot to think about, but you need to know this in order to start searching for your ideal singing tone. Until the next episode of Ask a Pianist, keep on practicing and start experimenting with ways to replicate the bass register sounds in the upper register. Bye for now.